this video, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the differences between a punishment or tool-based training system versus one that uses positive reinforcement or rewards. Now, this is going to be pretty general because all trainers have different ways of doing things as far as different exercises they might do or different skills they focus on at different times. However, these main principles are the same regardless of if you are using e-collars or if you're a trainer who uses primarily prong collars, or if you're a reward-based trainer who is teaching mainly obedience versus somebody who is teaching skills for reactivity. So these principles are the same for each class of trainer. And this is how learning works. And I'm going to teach you just about what the first session would look like between a tool-based training system versus, and it's very general terms, by the way, very, very general terms. There are tool-based trainers who don't do it this way. However, the majority of them, and at least the majority of them who are in my area, this is how they do things. And then we're also going to talk about how a rewards-based trainer would structure something. So, without further ado, the tool-based trainers, these would be trainers who are using choke collars, prong collars, e-collars, any sort of tool, maybe even a slip lead, a tool that you are using to correct the dog, to discipline the dog, to train the dog. It's a training tool that is used in the context of training to try to influence that dog's behavior. So those are going to be the tool using trainers. Positive reinforcement trainers are going to be the trainers who are using rewards, who are using clickers, who are using a rewards-based system and not relying on a tool-based system. So the first main difference is going to be in that first session of how the dog is exposed to the training process. In a tool-based system, since you are being punitive, you have to wait for the dog to make a mistake, and then that mistake is corrected by use of a collar or some other punitive device. So we are reliant on the dog making a mistake for us to then punish the dog with the hopes that the punishment will make that behavior decrease. So the first session for these dogs, and you guys have probably seen videos of this before, or some flavor videos of this, where there's a dog who has a reactivity problem or something. So they're barking and snarling at a different dog. Then the tool trainer gets a hold of this dog, puts a training collar on them or something, corrects them, and then by the end of the video or the end of the session, the dog is fixed. So what's actually happening in this process is the dog is avoiding the correction. From the dog's point of view, they actually don't know where why that correction is happening. Especially if that tool just gets put on the dog and the corrections just start happening. That dog does not know why they're getting corrected. They're just getting corrected out of the blue. It's arbitrary to the dog. They don't know. And so the dog learns that, okay, in this situation, I'm going to be corrected. I don't know what I'm being corrected for, so I'm just going to stop. Like, I'm not going to even look at the other dog. I'm not going to, do anything. I'm just going to try and stay in my lane and experiment with what's not going to get me corrected. So this, in human terms, would be like, let's say you're learning a new language, and your language teacher comes over to you and they ask you a question in a different language. You've never heard this language, you might know the name of it, but you don't know how to speak it. And they ask you a question, you say, "What? I don't understand." And they hit you. And they proceed with that pattern until you somehow produce an answer that is correct. And the correct answer is the one that doesn't earn you a punishment. So that's what that first session and the first few sessions of of training is going to be like with many tool using trainers. Not all of them, I want to make this very clear, not all of them, but very, very many of them are training in this way. And the problem with this is for the dog to learn, they have to be put into situations and they have to be set up so that they will fail. Because without the dog failing, you don't have anything to correct, right? And the training methodology is based on correction. You have to correct the dog to get the response that you wanted. So it's not actually teaching the dog what the response is. Like the dog has to stumble upon the right answer themselves. Does this mean that correction-based training doesn't work? No, but it's not very kind. It's not supportive of the dog. It's not very kind to them. It is very confusing to the dog in the first few sessions, at least. And there's just so much other like consequences that can happen that it's kind of not the first method of training you ever want to try with a dog. Plus, we have better ways of doing things. If we didn't have better ways, like if that was the best way, yeah, I would be doing it still. So, and that's the other caveat, guys. I used to be a trainer who, you know, I've been taught how to use tools and have used tools before on dogs. And I do know how to use them. I know what context to use them in. Like I used to be a balanced trainer. And in my experience, I have found better ways to do things, ways that are more kind, ways that are more supportive, that are quicker in the long run anyways. And that produce better results at the end of the day with the dog. So that's why I don't use tools, at least not at all in those types of methods. The other hand is how would we use, what would the first session be like with a positive reinforcement trainer? So we come at the problem from a different angle. First of all, we're going to teach the dog the skill. So let's say you have a dog that, this is a perfect example, you have a dog who pulls on leash. Well, first off, we're going to ask, does that dog actually know how to respond when they feel tension on the leash? Do they know that that means that they need to slow down and be with us? Do they know that maybe we want that dog to turn towards us? Do they know anything about the leash? If they don't know anything about the leash and how to respond to that leash tension, because the leash is a communication tool, FYI guys, then that's where we start. I'm going to teach this dog where I'd like them to be in relation to me. I'm going to make that a valuable experience for this dog through the use of rewards. And I'm going to be teaching them what to do when they feel tension on the leash. And then we're going to put those skills together and we're going to go use our loose leash walking skill. A punitive way to help a dog with loose leash walking, I can't even say it today. A punitive way to train a dog in that kind of method is you have the dog on a leash. They have the e-collar or the prong collar or the choke chain or whatever it is on. And then when they pull, you correct them. You just yank on the leash, you're pressing the e-collar button. And once again, for the dog, it's going to be arbitrary. They, of course, are going to learn over time like to avoid that correction, but they didn't necessarily learn it's because they were in the wrong position, like they weren't right next to you or they weren't keeping that leash slack. And the other thing that we see with correction-based training is that in general, when you don't have corrections anymore, like for example, you try to, you've been walking your dog on a prong collar, it's going really well, you decide to switch them to a harness or to a flat collar or something like that, like a normal collar. And then you start walking up, and then slowly, of course, the behavior of their loose leash walking, the dog is going to realize, oh, I'm not getting corrected anymore for pulling. It's not unpleasant. And they're going to go right back to doing that pulling because they're not having that correction anymore. So with tool-based training, a lot of the times you do create a crutch there. And once the tool is removed, the dog is kind of forever going to need that in some way, shape, or form. And once again, like, it is punitive, it is unpleasant. Your dog would not avoid a punishment if it wasn't unpleasant. So that's how punitive training works in a nutshell. Meanwhile, with training that uses reward, we're paying the dog for doing the right thing. We are not married to the rewards for all eternity. And that's a huge misconception that people have, like, oh, if I start using treats, I'm always going to have treats. And that is not true if you're doing the training appropriately. We teach the habit. We are teaching the dog. We are showing them how to do something, and we're building a habit with rewards, of course. But once it becomes a habit, we don't need to use the rewards so often. And we can also start building on that skill and creating more and more value in different places. So the other reality too of just dogs and dog training is our dogs are constantly being rewarded by the world at large. Like, they're being rewarded by scents that they smell. They're being rewarded by an activity and things like that. So even if you don't have, a food reward, you can make something rewarding for your dog because it inherently already is. And we can use those things to our advantage. So I just want to reassure you guys that just because you're using rewards in that teaching phase with your dog does not at all mean that you are stuck with rewards and have to use them all the time and oh, now you can never go back. It's not true at all, but you do have to get that habit instilled in your dog. So that's kind of, I just wanted to explain the two sort of separate sides of how you would approach something. On the one hand, you're teaching the dog. On the other hand, you're reliant on their mistakes. And it's one hand, it's more fair to the dog, like with rewards. We're always working at the dog's speed. We're always working at their level that they can go at. There's no force. There's no coercing. There's no, making the dog do anything. Because we're taking the feedback that the dog is giving us, whether they're ready to move on to something more difficult or not, and we're using that to tailor the training plan to the individual. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope that you guys learned something from this, because it is something that I think many people, the knowledge just isn't there. Like, no one's teaching you these basic, what is the actual difference? And that's the factual difference right there. You're either using rewards or you're using punishment. And just another disclaimer, guys, this is very watered down. This is a very general look at those two ways of training. There's definitely a spectrum. There is trainers who use some positive and also some correction. So this is not speaking towards all trainers at all. It's just giving you the very general idea of how reward-based principles work and how a punishment-based system would work. So anyways, hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.